Has Upstream helped make your worldview bigger and older? Maybe something you've heard on the show has shaped the way you view your calling, habits, vocation, or recreation. We want to hear from you. Visit colsoncenter.org/up-listeners to leave us a short audio message. We look forward to hearing from you. Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with my Colson Center colleague, Kasey Leander, to talk more about my conversation with Christopher Watkin about his book, Biblical Critical Theory, How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Life and Culture. Kasey, this is going to be a particularly relevant conversation for us because we're actually reading this book internally at the Colson Center as a staff group. So it's very fresh on our minds, and it's very relevant to the kind of stuff that we talk about all the time. In fact, I almost looked through this and the table of contents and the table of diagrams in his book, and it's like a cheat sheet. So next time I have to go write a commentary, I just feel like, I'll flip to the page on creation or sin or government or something like that.
No, for real. It's so good. I've been enjoying it. In fact, I was going to say, I brought it with me to the beach in Cancun recently on my wife and my belated honeymoon. So we were down there, and I definitely had Dr. Chris Watkin's book with me in paradise. So
wait, that was a belated honeymoon?
It was actually. Yeah, I didn't say that.
I totally didn't know. I would never have razzed you about it if I'd known it was a belated honeymoon, not just some random vacation.
Oh yeah,
That's
man.
so great.
Yeah.
Congrats.
Oh yeah, we're not going to Cancun every other week, but we got COVIDed out. So when we got married, that was the Omicron wave right in the middle of it. So
well, good job, guys. That's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, I just think that's a ringing endorsement of the book, at least to me, is like, I wanted to read it on the beach. So,
and you wanted to read it bad enough that you packed this cinder block of a book in your luggage and brought it all the way to Mexico.
Yeah. Had to check another bag for it, but it was worth it. I can say it was definitively worth it.
Yeah. The approach he's taking requires that kind of massive treatment because he's going through a book that is, of course, roughly the same size, or maybe a little bit smaller. I guess some of us have those fine print onion skin page Bibles, but this book is structured around the Bible itself, right? It's not structured around cultural questions. And that's the distinctive approach that he's taking here. And part of the reason, why, not just why it's so long, but why it's so helpful. And he said this in our conversation, and I'm glad he brought out this point because it's exactly one of the things I noticed about the book. It's that with Augustine's City of God, he doesn't just look at Rome and he go in his day and go, okay, here's this verse from Leviticus and this verse from Ephesians and this verse from the Gospel of Matthew that proves why the Romans are wrong on this kind of stuff. He doesn't do that at all. He brings to bear the whole Christian story and he sets it over and above Roman society. And he says, here's why the Christian story is just a better story than Rome. And the Christian story can explain Rome better than the Roman story can explain Rome. And that's exactly the sort of thing that Christopher Watkin is doing, although he's effusively humble about his inspiration and relation to Augustine. He's continually emphasizing, I am not trying to replicate what Augustine did or update it. I'm just taking inspiration from him and trying to hold a candle to his blazing sun of brilliance. But it really is evident. The Augustinian fingerprints are all over this thing because what he's doing is taking that biblical story, placing it over and above our cultural dichotomies and questions and debates, and just saying, look, the Bible and its story can explain 21st century Western society, which is primarily what he's focusing on, right? It's relevant for other people, but it's very, Western focused. It can explain that society better than the society itself is able to. And so I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just me, but this feels like a magnum opus from him. And I imagine we'll be referencing this book in 10, 20 years easily. Like it feels that significant to me. I don't know, maybe that won't play out in that way, but I just kind of have this sense that it will actually, that this will be one of those like sort of definitive books. There's just so many resources in it. Like you said, even as we're writing breakpoint commentaries.
Yeah. And the other thing that he does that's very clear is he brings a lot of different voices to bear on each subject. So he quotes everyone from, Lewis and Chesterton to Cornelius Van Til and Abraham Kuyper. I mean, these are names you'll know, But if you know anything about the kind of intra-Protestant discussion on a lot of apologetics issues, for instance, you'll know that these guys they take a different approach on a lot of things. They'll quote classical apologists and he'll quote more presuppositional apologists. These are differing schools on how you approach the whole issue of apologetics. And then, of course, the foreword is written by Tim Keller, who's got his own approach to apologetics that is in some ways informed by several of them. But I guess I would place him more in the Francis Schaeffer style of apologetics. And so he's quoting all these different apologists, but the Van Tillian fingerprints are challenging to me because I've been fairly critical for the most part of that whole apologetic school. Early on, I guess in my interest in theology, I encountered Van Til, was really impressed with the approach, and then realized later on it had some shortcomings and wasn't really fully conversant with the historical traditions of apologetics, that there was much more to be had in that more classical apologetics approach. And I guess R.C. Sproul was the one who sort of defended and turned me on to that, helped me understand, no, the proofs for God's existence and so forth, talking rationally with the unbeliever, assuming that they actually do have a mind that's able to grasp the general revelation around them and that can be a foothold. That's a totally appropriate approach. And I disagree with someone like Cornelius Van Til when he denounces that or when he shies away from that. But there's also something to be said for this Van Tillian idea that you can't give our culture or its dichotomies and its questions, its traps, its mental false dilemmas, the first word on a subject, that Christianity has to pose the questions, not merely give the answers to these important debates. So, he quotes Van Til. He's not captive to him, but one of the ways you see this instinct play out in the book is that he insists on making the biblical story the original thing with which the cultural dichotomies are compared and contrasted. And I think that's right. You don't just approach an issue like, for instance, the justice versus mercy dilemma or dichotomy, and then say, okay, well, the Bible can add this important element to it. No, you have to back up to the very beginning and ask what those things are within the biblical story before you can see why our culture has so badly misunderstood them and set them at odds with one another when they're really complementary realities, things that can, in the Christian story at least, meet and reinforce one another in a beautiful way. That's the heart of the gospel, right? Justice meeting mercy.
I think a dominant theme from your conversation, Shane, for me was that the Bible, like you're saying, got there first. So even our cultural tendency to think about justice and mercy, that dialogue between them is so crystal clear because that's what's at the center of the gospel message. And if Christianity had never come, we might be, vaguely aware of that tension, but it just wouldn't be front and center in our imaginations like it is actually for most people living in a post-Christian context. And so I really appreciated that, that link to me for what your guys' conversation about, what does the Bible mean to non-Christians? I just think that's such a good question to start with. It's actually a fascinating question to start with. I'd be curious for you to comment more on that. What do you think the Bible means to non-Christians, Shane, like in our cultural moment?
Yeah, I think that the Bible consciously means very little to non-Christians because they view it as this artifact of religion that's very outdated and unnecessary and in many ways immoral. So they'll look at it on a conscious level, both on a popular level and even I guess academics or more educated secular or non-believers will look at the Bible and say, we don't need that sort of thing anymore. Not only is it unnecessary, it's actually immoral or contrary to things that we know now and have concluded are true. But of course, there's a very potent critique you can level against that impulse, and that is to ask where the values and the moral instincts by which, and even the scientific and epistemological instincts that the modern person brings to bear and looks back at the Bible with and says, I don't need that. And I don't want that because it's wrong, because there's something defective about it. There's something defective about not wanting, not approving of homosexual relationships, to take one example of that moral opprobrium that would fall in the Bible. The thing they don't understand is that those instincts that they're bringing to bear against the Bible are themselves shaped by the Christian past and Scripture. So they're not actually free from the influence of the Bible. The very foundations of science by which the Bible is sort of glibly critiqued, and there's the naturalistic assumptions get twisted in with the scientific critique illegitimately. So you're doing philosophy, not science at that point. But even those have their foundations in all these biblical assumptions. But it's unexamined. Everything I just described is an unexamined process. And so I encounter this again and again when I talk with people, when I read secular writers, particularly the very moralistic ones, the ones that have a lot of ought claims, not just is claims, right? You even see this in the arch secular new atheists back in the early 2000s, I guess, where Richard Dawkins famously denounced Christianity as is not just wrong and outdated and foolish, but actually as immoral. The Christian God is wicked. He's a capricious bully and a tyrant and so forth. You get this moralistic language condemning Christianity on those grounds. And the thing you got to notice about that, everything from Richard Dawkins to over on the other side of the spectrum, the social justice warriors who currently hate Richard Dawkins and are trying to cancel him, right? Because he believes in male and female as biological concepts. The thing you got to notice about all those is that they're all assuming this massive patrimony of moral and scientific and social knowledge that they just accept as given, but it's not given. And you remember from my conversation with Dr. Watkin that he really highlights the importance of just realizing that what you believe is not automatic or obvious to everyone, that you're not born into the world as a liberal Democrat. You're not born into the world believing in equality for all and political liberties and rights of free expression and things like that. Those are patrimonies of the society in which you were born. And those patrimonies themselves were shaped by a long history, a long story. And you have to know that story in order to properly, I guess, go head to head with go toe to toe with the religion that you want to critique. So the Bible. But you also have to know that story in order to understand yourself and to have the humility to realize, no, my beliefs are not obvious. They're not automatic. So that's a long answer. But your question is, how do modern people view the Bible? And I think that the answer really is if they don't know a little bit of history, or take it into consideration, then they approach the Bible with a vast ignorance of its importance even to them.
How would you respond to someone who just says, great, okay, thanks for that patrimony. I don't care. I hear you and I raise you one step of just not caring. I still don't like what the Bible says. I'm against it. So thank you very much for some of the phrases from the King James, and thank you for, X, Y, or Z. Thank you for kind of enshrining, helping religious liberty, even separation of church and state kind of develop, but still, no thanks, I'm out. Practically boots on the ground, so what? What would you respond to? How would you respond if someone came with that objection?
Well, I would say, why should I care about what you think then? You're making a lot of moral claims. You're making a lot of social justice claims. You want me to agree to and abide by a certain set of moral claims that you're making on the whole of society, right? There's nobody today just says live and let live. That kind of liberalism is just dead. The non-Christian Western world is just on fire with moral pronouncements and expectations that you will live this sort of way. You will show respect and acknowledgement to the authentic selfhood of everyone who wants you to memorize a bunch of different pronouns or ways of accommodating them in everyday life, or legally recognizing them, or something like that. We all make claims on each other constantly. They're based on some kind of authority. So I guess if the answer is why should I care about the Bible, even though I've acknowledged that it's an integral part of my history as a Westerner who came out of a Christian civilization, then my question is, well, why should I care about your claims? On whose authority should I accept them? and again, you hear the Van Tillian register here, and I want to be cautious because I think there are legitimate critiques of that way of doing apologetics, but is true. And none other than C.S. Lewis makes this exact kind of argument. It's like, why should I care about your moral claims if you want to throw everything to the wind and just say the Scripture's moral claims and the history the redemptive history within which it situates us don't matter? Well, they do matter. And we had an editorial discussion earlier today, and I think it was Frank Turek that John Stonestreet referred to, who said, when someone tells him, well, who are you to say this? He says, well, who are you to say, who are you? And it's not just being cute. It really gets down to this authority issue. There is such a thing as epistemic or epistemological authority. And for someone to make a claim over your life, a moral claim, an ought, means that they're appealing to something. Well, what exactly are they appealing to? And I think if you do a little bit of quick digging, you find that most moralistic, modern, secular people who want to make claims of that sort have very little beyond assumptions at the basis of it. They have very little other than the assumption that this is just right, this is obvious, everyone knows this, and if you don't know this, then you're a monster or you're a deviant of some kind. Well, hang on, rewind just a couple of decades and interrogate yourself if you were alive back then, or your parents. This is new. Where did it come from? And says who? Why should we abide by these morals?
In an absolute sense, we believe Christianity because it's true, because Jesus actually is the risen Son of God, and there's no life outside of him. And if the whole history of the world had been, dominated by, let's say, Buddhism, the opposite kind of philosophy, and Christians were just a tiny minority who had never had any cultural impact on the world, Christianity would still be true, if Jesus had indeed come in the flesh and risen from the dead. So in an apologetic sense, that's true. But I think it's particularly important, Shane, just because we're so insulated, I think, from how bad things could get. I think we take for granted, for example, you were like the live and let live principle. Where in the world do we get that? That is such a dearly held liberty. And it is so freakishly rare in the history of humanity. But you know what? And tell me if I'm going to get this quotation wrong. I think it was Augustine who said, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. That itself is a Christian principle.
I don't know if it came from Augustine, but it definitely captures something of the Augustinian spirit. But yeah, I've heard it attributed to various authors.
If it's not from Augustine, feel free to write Shane an angry email, listeners, and just chew him out for getting it so badly wrong. No, but I think when we start talking about society, some of these ideas have real legs, in the sense that the way we structure society is deeply Judeo-Christian. And there is a pretty big so what in that sense. And maybe that's the rhetorical move, to just remind people of hey, look down under your feet. The ground you're standing on, warts and all, it's pretty good ground. And it was put there by actually accurate views of human nature, of justice and mercy, things that the Bible introduced into the stream of human consciousness that, aside from leading to salvation, right, which you can believe in the wisdom of Christian principles and not be saved by a long shot. But so salvation aside, its primary purpose has also led to lots of good things in society. So it's almost just like a rhetorical tool to get them to think about the truth and the beauty of the gospel. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, it's absolutely fair. And you don't have to be a jerk about this sort of thing. You can actually ask these questions in a way that's revealing and illuminating to people. Now, some folks are just going to be threatened automatically by these sorts of challenges and this sort of interrogation. So you can't avoid that necessarily. But there are, I think, plenty of unbelievers, plenty of secular-minded conversation partners who would be willing to look under the hood of their own worldview, as it were, and ask some of these questions. And I've met people like this. I remember one conversation I had in DC at this class we were doing a long time ago at a political think tank, and I was talking with this guy about the resurrection, and I pulled out some of the old classical resurrection proofs or arguments, I should say, the lines of argument that the resurrection was authentic, and at the end he just said, that's a pretty compelling line of reasoning. I'm not sure what to do with that, but thanks. I'll give that some thought. I'll get back to you. And at that point, I guess the right thing to do is not to push someone or bully someone and just say, yeah, that's a very reasonable place to sit. You're at a place of uncertainty and you got to think some more about it. And that was just on the sort of historic apologetics front. But when you're asking someone about their moral claims, you're asking them, why is it that you think this? I mean, why do you believe in the idea, as we talked about with John Stuart Mill, that harm is the basis of real morality, that avoiding harm is all you need to do. And that as long as you're not hurting anyone, right? This is the basis of that famous saying that was kind of thrown around as the moral argument for gay marriage back in the early to, I guess, the 2000s to 2010s was, how does what two men or two women do in the privacy of their own bedroom affect you? How does it hurt your marriage, right? Well, there are a lot of interesting answers and a lot of surprisingly compelling responses to that just on the harm principle, right? Because it turns out that you can't redefine an institution for an entire society that encompasses all of life in many ways and is the site in which new human beings are generated and trained into existence without there being some real repercussions and true harms. Okay, so set aside that for a second. You can push further and ask about the principle itself. Well, who says that something is okay as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else? What do you mean by hurt? What do you mean by harm? How are you defining that? And why do you believe that law is limited only to the realm of harm, of as Jefferson would say, picking someone's pocket or breaking someone's legs? Why is that the case? Can you show that's actually a good basis to make law? And if so, if you want to argue that, then we can have a lot of other conversations about what the implications of that and so forth. I mean, this is a radical principle that most people throughout history have not believed. And most people today who argued for something like gay marriage on that basis are showing that they don't believe it. Because Kasey, I'd neither pick someone's pocket nor breaks their leg if I refer to them by the wrong pronouns. But a lot of people sure seem to care a whole lot about that. Why? Well, because harm has now been redefined and stretched to encompass, psychological harm, things like that. Oh, you're hurting. That's violence. That's a microaggression. You see where this goes immediately, because people can't live with the harm principle. It's actually nonsense once you try to work it out in a society of people. It just doesn't work for a whole host of reasons. And so if it doesn't work, then you have to do some real interrogation. But at that point, you're at the base of someone's authority structure. That was the work of just a few moments. I think that sort of thing can be a powerful apologetic, and it's exactly the sort of thing that Watkin is pointing out so well in this book.
Yeah, I think that's good stuff. I would say that the harm principle is a valid principle. It's a valid moral intuition that people have. But divorced from a bigger picture, it can lead us down some paths that no one probably saw coming. For example, I think the harm principle combined with sort of the radical individualism that we have, that's sort of the unspoken question behind it, right? I'm an individual. Why should my actions impact anyone else? Well, specifically with marriage. And by the way, with the marriage debate, if we're talking about criminalizing homosexual behavior and going out and prosecuting people who are doing this in the privacy of their own bedroom, we might be having a different discussion. But actually what we're talking about is redefining our legal view of marriage. That's a whole different question. That by definition it's not an individualist question at all. It's very much shared real estate on that. And so, yeah, that harm principle combined with a radical individualism, it's led us. And again, even in 2015, I don't think anyone really thought this will lead to a society where we're ready to abolish biological sex as a category, And yet here we are. People are losing their jobs for acknowledging that men and women are real entities and refusing to say otherwise. It's not as bad as it could be, but it is pretty shocking how fast that happened. So I hear your point on that.
I like the way he pointed out too that, and this is not an original point to him necessarily, but it really comes through clearly in what he writes and what he said in our conversation, that a lot of these dichotomies he's tackling are intra-theological debates. I like the way he expressed that. This reemphasizes the dependence of modern secular sensibilities, moral sensibilities on the Christian past. They are what Chesterton would call those Christian virtues sundered from one another and wandering in the wilderness by themselves, attempting to be the sole virtue that encompasses all morality. They've set themselves up as absolutes. And when you do that, they turn into monstrosities, they turn into vices, or they turn into nonsense. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing with each of these. If you set up something like mercy as the absolute virtue, or tolerance as the absolute virtue, well, there's a place for mercy, there's a place for tolerance, but it's within this larger moral framework of virtues and ethics that Christianity has historically championed, because they complement one another. They make it possible to exercise each virtue without overreaching, and there's a multidimensional aspect to morality that these reductive attempts, like the harm principle, fail to grasp. And that's why they fall apart so quickly. That's why immediately you begin to get your pocket picked or your leg broken on the basis of doing something that violates someone's moral sensibility that goes well beyond the harm principle. But again, those are theological instincts. It's an intra-theological debate. You can't have this kind of debate, at least not in the form that you've got it in the modern world, without Christianity. Because if we were, pre-Christian Northern Europeans, were Vikings or Anglo-Saxons or something, then these debates are going to be solved a very different way. In fact, we're not going to have these debates. Predominantly, we're going to have the debates over who gets whose land and whose women and whose gold. And that's going to be solved through pitched battle. And the outcome of that battle, by the way, will be seen as legitimate, because it has been ordained by the gods, and the strong deserve to rule the weak. That's just how it is. The Viking would have scratched his head at the idea that the weak actually deserve not to be treated badly or trodden down upon. That's Jesus morality. That's what Nietzsche would have called slave morality. He hated that stuff, but that's what the modern liberal secular person is going to be assuming. But there's a story behind that. They're not acknowledging that story.
Yeah. I think it's important to recognize too that this doesn't mean that morality is relative or our cultures. There's a bandwidth within which cultures diverge, because there are some constants of human nature, right? So every society in some ways is going to grapple by dint of being human with some of the same questions of eternity and meaning, right? And value. But I think to Dr. Watkin's point, and to your point, Shane, it's like, we don't understand just how deeply our culture has affected us. For me, an example was just recently reading the Odyssey, and Ulysses ends up sleeping with just a ton of different people as he makes his way back to Penelope. And something that was so shocking for me is like, that's so wrong. But it doesn't even rise to the level of anyone asking like, Ulysses, what are you doing? Why are you sleeping with that beautiful woman? No one calls him out like, hey man, you're married. What are you doing here? Yeah, it's like mentioned in the story is like, yes, another part of Ulysses' adventure home. And as a Christian, I'm sitting there reading it like, that's so messed up, man. She's there like denying all these suitors for years, thinking that maybe he's dead, but there's a slim chance he's alive. And Ulysses is just, for him, it's like, can't wait to get back to my fireplace, really miss that old rocking chair by the fireplace. Like, dude. Anyway, that's just an aside. But for me, that's like one of the examples culturally that's hit home the most.
So we haven't talked a whole lot about the content of the book as much as the theory and approach behind it. And that's fine. That's totally legitimate, because I think that the best way to encounter this stuff is not for you and I to sit here and explain it to listeners, but for the listeners to pick up the book and read it themselves, because it's really cool stuff. Dr. Watkin explains it in just this...
Bring it to the beach.
Just this amazing way. Yeah, exactly. Pack it up, bring it to the beach, check an extra bag. You should be fine. TSA should let that through, no problem. But I will say, I think we ought to throw out a couple of our favorite examples. So if you want to go first and just pick something from your reading of the book so far, we've talked about it a little bit in these discussions in staff. But if you want to pick a dichotomy and one of what he calls diagonalization moves that really illuminates the question and the answer, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much to choose from. This book is almost like a manual. It's like a manual of all of these conversations. That's why it's valuable to me. It's like there's nothing he doesn't talk about, and there's nothing he doesn't give you an amazing primer for talking about. I think, and he mentioned this in the conversation, the image of God is something that we just can't underestimate. And I like when he talks about how it does two things. It dignifies and it humbles us. And to me, I think in particular, where I apply that is in looking at pop culture right now and looking at people wrestling with either the over godlikeness of people or else making way too little of people. So one example where we make way too little of people, I just wrote about this in a breakpoint, is oftentimes in conservation, where there's 8 billion people on the planet and we have so little care for some of those issues. It's like we get in this mode of thinking that people are just cancer. Look at us building with our asphalt in our cities and we're just expanding needlessly. It's like, gosh, I just hate people, right? And I'm from Colorado, so that sentiment is near and dear to my heart. Like, don't you just hate people? Yeah, man, me too. Like, just walk west into the mountains and get away from it all. Like, that's like the heart of Colorado. On the other hand, we make way too much of people. I was expressing frustration in one of the book series that I've actually really enjoyed by Brandon Sanderson. It's the Stormlight Archive. At the apex of that book there's a moment where a character sort of does the classic move where they reach within themselves and they emerge with this, like they save the day just by like kind of finding their own inner strength that they weren't aware of, but that they've always had lurking within them, And my sister and I were reading these books at the same time. And I just expressed frustration. I was like, why is this always the move? Like, they're trapped, they're cornered, but then within themselves is the power they've always sought. They have merely to believe, to unleash it upon the world. Yeah, to me, it's like we need the image of God because it makes sense of both of those phenomena. We are not God. We're fellow creatures. And so what we do with the world matters, but neither are we nothing. There actually is something compelling about looking at fellow human beings and being drawn to worship your creator. And actually, my sister said something to me that's stuck with me. She said, absent a view of God, if you don't know the God of creation and you just look around you, what's the closest thing you have to him in your everyday life? It actually is other people. And so to me, that's something I've been chewing on a lot recently, is like that helps me make sense of culture's reach for an appropriate place to locate human beings. What about you, Shane? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I was actually going to point to the chapter that you're mentioning here, which is the chapter on creation. I thought that was just astounding, especially the nature improvement dichotomy that he sets out in this helpful figure and diagonalizes. That was really a key to the discussion that we had recently about a breakpoint that you wrote. And this is centering around that whole question of, okay, we've reached this peak of population, roughly 8 billion people. It's going to start declining soon. And then in the process, we've wrecked a bunch of natural land and killed off a huge part of the Earth's native fauna, right? There's very little mammalian fauna left compared to what it used to be. In fact, it's something like what was it? It's a tiny percentage weight-wise that wild mammals account for versus humans and our domesticated things. What was it? Do you remember?
The total combined biomass of every wild mammal. So everything from every herd of deer, every whale in the ocean, the total combined biomass is only 6% of the total mammalian biomass on the planet. So humans account for like 300 million tons. And domesticated animals like cows are like, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's like another 600 million tons.
It's something like twice what we are. Yeah. Because we've got all those cheeseburgers running around in pastures around the world. But that's exactly, that's the kind of statistic. And I heard David Attenborough cite that stat. We talked about him in the Planet Earth series. And this is kind of what sparked that discussion. He cites that at this award banquet of some kind as this support for the idea that humankind is just a parasite on the planet and that we've just eradicated and wrecked everything else. And so you see this is the hard left, if you will, of the nature improvement dichotomy that says pristine nature must be preserved at all costs. Humankind is an intrusion on that. Therefore, we have to radically reverse our influence or draw back and end our influence on nature because it's simply destructive in all its forms. Then there's the other side. We might call it the radical right of this dichotomy. And that's the improvement side that says nature belongs to us. It's here as raw material simply for us to exploit. And so it would be ridiculous to ever prioritize these things for their own sake above the needs of mankind. In fact, everything needs to be couched in terms of our human needs. And you see this even in this. I recently read this amazing book. I've mentioned it before. Michael Grunwald's The Swamp. It's about Florida and the Everglades. It's called Florida, the Everglades, and the Politics of Paradise. That's the subtitle. And it's just this chronicle of the history of the Everglades, especially since European habitation began, and the tremendous damage that American politics and industry has done to this delicate ecosystem that I love so much, being here in Florida. And one of the points that he draws out is that the improvements to the so-called improvements, quote unquote, to the Everglades, right? Dredging and diking and draining and trying to just turn this into a bunch of farmland, is that it needs to be good for human beings. And that's the sole criterion. And even in the early stages of Everglades conservation, it was sold to the public and to other politicians under the guise of this will help people, right? So this has some sort of benefit for people. It wasn't until very recently that you get this language of conservation being done in the name of preserving these things for their own sake, just because they are worth having around. We don't necessarily have to have this utilitarian human justification for everything. Well, that's the dilemma that we're sort of stuck in a lot of times. Is it all just good for humans, or is it that humans are the problem? Well, Christianity actually offers a powerful alternative to both of those. An instance that's not a third way, it's not halfway in between the two. It's where those two poles of the dichotomy can kind of be buried and rise again as something new, which is this created in the image of God stewardship, where we go out, we are to have dominion and care for the creation. We're to tend that garden. And we do so precisely because the God who created it values it. He said it's very good. And it's not very good for the sake of humans. It's actually very good because he said it's very good. It's good because it's valuable to him, not because it's valuable to us solely. And it's deeply humbling. And it's a basis for environmental preservation and stewardship that a purely secular outlook won't give you, that humans as a virus outlook simply won't give you. And I'm convinced it leads to some beautiful untapped places that we really need to explore. But a diagonalization, if you want to put it Dr. Watkin's way, of that dichotomy really helps us get there in an important way that we've neglected desperately.
Well said. One of my dear friends is named Zandra Carroll. She was a conservation biologist. So she talks about I think it was Papua New Guinea, dragging this artificial nest up a massive, like miles long hike up a mountain. And they're going to, put a bunch of these heavy metal contraptions that they've made to try to rehab these birds back into the wild. It's like an almost extinct species. And she talks about like doing that, amidst all this drudgery. She just was like, why are we doing this? Why are we going to all this work for one species of bird? And one of her best, she's an apologist and gives this talk about how naturalism could not have provided her with an answer for that question. Why should she lug an artificial bird cage to try to rehabilitate and grow the population of this almost extinct bird? You need a better source of values. Christianity gives us that. I was going to ask though, Shane, I love Dr. Watkin's book. It's rich. I'm still processing it. One question that I've had though, just to play devil's advocate here, is why do we need the word diagonalization? Sometimes my head spins around that word and I'm like, there's already so many like mental constructs that I'm trying to keep in this brain, trying to make sense of how different ideas flow. Diagonalization feels like it could be useful, but why not use like other terms like, hey, there's a third way that Christianity provides her. So I was going to ask you, have you wrestled with that? And if so, what do you find helpful or valuable about the term diagonalization as opposed to other ways of thinking about Christianity sort of breaking through dichotomies?
that's a very good question. I don't think he's necessarily married to that term. I mean, other than it being in print as one of the key terms in his book. I don't think he's especially invested in it, though, as opposed to a term like harmonization or resolving a paradox. This is something that I guess C.S. Lewis was really helpful on this in a number of ways. Like in Mere Christianity, he talks about the Trinity in the chapter Beyond Personality. He gives this analogy of someone who's only lived in a two-dimensional world, like a stick figure person, trying to comprehend a three-dimensional person like us. And he says the stick figure person simply lacks the categories to understand the three-dimensional person. There's another dimension, the depth that this person can't get because all he knows is height and width. And so that's a paradox to him. It seems unresolvable because he's stuck in a dilemma. It's like, is it up or is it to the side? Well, it's a different thing you don't know about, you don't understand. And there's a way to resolve that paradox. And for him, it takes an element of faith because the stick man can describe depth in a sort of dogmatic or technical way, but he can't experience depth until he becomes that three-dimensional being. He has to go beyond what he knows of personality. And so something I think very similar is going on with the Christian diagonalization or harmonization of a lot of these apparent dilemmas. The dichotomy language comes in when you think there are two poles that are mutually exclusive to something. So you can either have mercy or you can have justice, or you can either have sacred groves or you can have timber for paper mills, right? Just humans whacking everything down, but you can't have both. Well, what if those two things are actually, you can harmonize them in a way with reference to a third thing, not a third way, because I think he tries to stay away from the third way language simply because it implies a medium, like a happy medium, a mushy room temperature sort of, okay, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and it reduces the quality of both. That's exactly the sort of thing he's trying to avoid, as Chesterton tried to avoid that when he talks about Christianity's ability to harmonize virtues that seem to be in conflict, because he says what we're doing is we have both things in their fiery fullness. We're not negating either one. There's actually a way to harmonize them that you've missed because your worldview is too small. Your thinking is too blinkered. You're too hidebound in your own way of looking at things. And what has to happen is, number one, you're going to get that virtue that you love affirmed very fully in a way that you can't even comprehend right now. But you're also going to have to let it die. You're also going to have to sacrifice it so it can be resurrected as something new, because your wisdom is actually foolishness and God's wisdom looks like foolishness. It's what you call foolishness right now. So those things they're going to meet in the future. I think that's the core of what he's getting at with diagonalization. He's trying to get us out of those vicious dilemmas, those vicious either ors, and get us to be able to say there's something much more marvelous and complex beyond the, height and width that we can understand right now. There's a depth. And once we incorporate that, we're going to be able to see a lot more. But you have to have a tolerance for mystery and paradox in order to get that. And I'm convinced that that's the wisdom of God. That's what it actually consists in. And so I want to ask you, is there a way you see this kind of thing working out beyond the categories or dichotomies that he lists in this book? Because I think this principle works for all kinds of polarities that our culture throws at us.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I'm going to fire that question back at you in a second, because I think it's so rich. In fact, some of the richest breakthroughs in my own devotional life, in being mentored by wise Christians, consist in breaking down to opposite things that I think, I'm going to have to choose between one or the other of them, and realizing like the Lord is better than both of them. And he's going to guide me through on the straight and narrow path between them. The one that comes to my mind is confidence versus humility. I think in my life, I've tended to look at confidence as being the same thing as arrogance at times. Like, how dare you be that sure, that certain of anything, Because, I think we've all encountered people. If you haven't, you are this person. So take heed, where nothing can change their mind. Just absolutely nothing. They've never changed their mind on anything. They are just like supremely confident. On the flip side, we've encountered people where it's actually hard to engage or interact with them because what seems like humility is seeping from every pore. They're like, no, I'm nothing. I'm a worm. You're like, hey, thanks for having me. This is a beautiful home. No, brother, it's nothing. Like I've done nothing. I earned nothing, none of this. And you're like, well,
we call those Canadians.
True indeed. True indeed. Yeah. So, you find both of those poles in life, and definitely in my own life, I've vacillated between some version of either of them. So, one question I've had is, Lord, where do confidence and humility actually meet? And again, Shane, we can't go 5 minutes without talking about C.S. Lewis, but so be it. He's the master, he's like our contemporary Augustine in a sense. Like he was so dominant. Anyway, C.S. Lewis talks about real humility never feels smarmy is the word that he uses for it. I just think that's so true. He's like, if you ever encountered a genuinely humble person, you wouldn't actually think, wow, that guy's really humble. You'd just feel pleased because much of the conversation had been about you and there'd been a really good back and forth. So in my mind, it's like confidence and humility are reconciled in the truth of the gospel, which is that there are some things which are true and they're worth being bold about. And also we've all been forgiven much and we need to forgive much. And so there's a reconciliation that Jesus gets. And I'm still trying to follow that thread even deeper because that one comes up daily, in my life and just in what I feel like the Lord's teaching me in this season. So
that's what he calls, he actually calls that, I'll just add this, charity. And he says that we should pursue charity, not this negative virtue of unselfishness. And actually the demons encourage us to pursue unselfishness precisely because it's a negation. And so we're just constantly hammering ourselves and going, don't be selfish, don't be selfish, don't be selfish, do not be arrogant. But you're never going to actually attain a positive virtue by just trying to stomp down the vice. You actually have to build the positive virtue. And the positive virtue looks like what he said, that genuine interest in all selves, not just yourself, but everyone. And you would come away thinking, what a delightful chap. What a nice conversation. You would never think, oh, he thinks he's a smarmy little worm or he's smarmy, but he thinks he's a greasy little nothing.
You know what? Honestly, Shane, this is embarrassingly practical, but one element of this that makes me laugh is that sometimes my wife actually wants me to choose the restaurant.
Right.
She doesn't have a preference. She just wants me to choose. And unselfishness is no, but what do you want? And you get into that, first world problem cycle. Where do you want to go? Oh man, I don't know. I could go anywhere. What about you? You're just
you have begun your journey down a rabbit hole that has no end, my brother.
No, it has to have an end, Shane. We have to have gospel confidence in picking the restaurant.
Kasey's like, you know what? In a couple of years, I'm going to understand women. I'm going to get it all figured out. And I don't know exactly what to say to my wife.
1 year into marriage and the prospects still seem pretty good. So I think I have it about figured out, Shane. And yeah, we got it.
There you go. Well, I'll throw this in and then we got to wrap this episode up. My outside of Watkin's book, dichotomy, that I have encountered in my life and I think is that Christianity beautifully harmonizes is the dichotomy of strength and weakness. And this is very similar to the one that you brought up. In fact, it's often we see these things manifested, humility and arrogance or humility and confidence, right? They get manifested in the strength and weakness dichotomy. In Christianity, weakness subverts strength because it's a channel for submission to and union with God, who is the ultimate strength. So this is where you get the language of God's foolishness being the wisdom of the world, of God's strength being weakness to the world, of the first being last and the last being first, of the one who puts himself at the far end of the table being invited up by the master and who says, come, friend, you've chosen too low a place for yourself because the humble will be exalted and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. There's a reason for this. And I think it goes back to the fall of Satan, that Satan is the ultimate advocate of brute force, of power in a raw sense. He worships power. He worships strength. He has a dogma of strength. And of course, as Lewis said, the thing that the trouble with God when you're proud is that in him you run up against something that is immeasurably and undeniably superior to yourself and always will be. And so what do you do in that instance? Well, in Satan's instance, as the ultimate manifestation of a proud being, he rebels against God and he says, I will become my own God. And that's his whole mission. It's an insanity. But in the process of that, he has perfected the art of brute strength. Well, God could just squash him like a bug. God could just end evil forever. But he chooses not to do that. And I think that's what's so interesting to me about this strength and weakness thing. God doesn't assert his superior strength against Satan and just say, I'm going to end the story right here and extinguish evil forever. He actually subverts Satan's dogma of strength through weakness. And this is how he makes an open shame of Satan, that Jesus comes as a child, as a man of little means, as a servant. That's the way the New Testament puts it. And then he submits himself. He empties himself. This is the kenosis. He empties himself, and then he submits himself to death, even death on a cross. And why is this? Well, it's because God is subverting the devil's strength through weakness. And it works not because weakness is somehow able to best strength in and of itself, but because weakness is a conduit by which faith appropriates the strength of God, by which faith receives the strength of the Holy Spirit. So God empowers Jesus in his submission, in his loving obedience to the Father, through raising him from the dead, through conquering death by death and trampling down upon it, as Athanasius would put it, that beautiful image of life itself being swallowed in death and then bursting out because death can't contain the author of life. That's that wonderful paradox. And I think it's also why we love underdogs and stories, things like that. We don't just love a powerful dude who comes in and sorts it out with fists flying. There's a Jackie Chan movie here and there, and that's fun to watch, that sort of thing. But really what we love is the underdog who pulls it off after being crushed into the dirt and his weakness being shown up. You have to have that dark night of the soul before you can rise up into the triumph of the climax of the story. And that all goes back to that architecture of strength and weakness. Those two things can be harmonized because God is the ultimate strength and he subverts Satan's religion of strength through weakness.
Really well said, Shane. Man, that was such a great answer to that question. Jackie Chan is the underdog.
Yeah. Okay. Is he the underdog? Am I getting Jackie Chan the lore wrong here?
No. I mean, and it's not like I'm the expert. I was just going to make the comment. Jackie Chan feels like the underdog because he's so happy. He's not like this, just like too gangster, kung fu guy. He's like smiling like, hi. And then he like just kicks their butts. So in a sense, Jackie Chan is almost like a type, of Christ, reflects the weakness beating strength in that. So,
oh, of course, we have to have it in every story, even Rocky. You get this excellent boxer, but you can't be satisfied with the story unless he's first like beaten down and then has to rise up from the place of humiliation. That's it. You just won't be satisfied with it because of that. And that's because we know that strength is subverted through weakness and this beautiful paradoxical harmonization. And with that, we've talked enough. I enjoyed this episode a lot because it's so meaty. There's so much to draw out of this book. And I look forward to, finishing it myself, talking about it more with the Colson staff, and hopefully being informed by this in the future with my own apologetic efforts, with my own faith, my own efforts to teach my family. Dr. Watkin has contributed something really special here, and I know it'll continue to be useful for the church and for thinkers and writers and, Lord willing, for podcasters for years to come. So thanks for joining me, Kasey. I enjoyed.